Okay, so if you're following the assignment description, next it tells you to go ahead and do the same thing for your sections and your articles. And we didn't need to add or change the display property for our header, main, footer, or body. But now if we want our sections to sit next to each other, we do want to change the display. So I'm going to go ahead and do all of that for section and article now. And if we look at our HTML, we can see how this is already broken up for us. So you don't need to add those in. I'm going to have you add more into the HTML a little bit later. But since we're only using our element selector so far, we're just using the tag names as the selector. So we don't need to add anything into the HTML. So here I have two sections. I have a section around all of the text content, and then I have a section around the images. And then in the text content, I have 3 articles. So 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so first off, I'm going to go ahead and add in my CSS. I'm going to add in my section. I'm going to give it a background color for now, even though I'm probably going to either change or get rid of that background color a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and add in section and grab another color. I already know this yellow, I'm not going to want it. It's too dark for the text to be against it, but just for demo purposes, I want you to be able to see it. So let's go ahead and just add that in for now. I'll go ahead and give it a width, and if I want these 2 sections that I have to sit next to each other once I change the display, they've got to be small enough to sit next to each other. So if I think about 100% of the parent, these 2 elements need to sit inside of the parent, and usually you would think, okay, then they can be 50%. But you have to think ahead. You're not only going to need that width of the element, you're going to add padding, maybe border. So if it's set to 50%, remember if you then add padding and border, you then make it bigger. Then it would be too big to stay on the same line, and it would still drop down. So I'm going to probably need to adjust this later, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and set it to 45%. Then I give it a little wiggle room so that I can have some margin and space in borders. For now, the height, I have content already in there, so for now I'm going to set that to auto. We'll change that a little bit later. You'll see why. And let's take a look. We have background width and height. Let's go ahead and take a look at what's happening now. And I can now see my preview, and I see that yellow color that I gave the sections, and there are these 2 sections, but they are sitting on top of each other because sections are block level elements. That means we need to use display to allow them to become inline. So here I'll add the display property, and I'll set the value to inline, but I'm going to actually go to inline dash block, because inline elements, you cannot give them a width and a height. They will always get their width and height from their content. You could then add padding around that content, but you can't actually give them a width and height. So if I change the display property of these sections to inline, the width and height would no longer apply, and I would run into some issues. Inline dash block allows them to sit inline together, but because it's also block, you can give it a width and height. So our display is inline dash block. If I go ahead and bounce over to my preview, I see they're now sitting next to each other, and I have some room. One thing about doing it this way is you'll see my sections don't line up. We're just going to have to deal with that for now. In our next module, I'll teach you what's called floating, and with that, you won't have that issue. It's a much better way to do it. You usually don't change the display property, but I wanted you to learn it, and it's easier to learn than floating. You'll see next time floating's quite hard. It's a more complicated method. So we'll learn that next. For now, we're just going to use display. So when you're doing yours, don't worry. The 2 sections may not line up. If you take your viewport and you pull it in and out, you can eventually get them to line up. So if you want to do that, you can. But when you go to turn it in, don't worry. The example photo that I added, they do line up, but just know you don't have to have them lined up when you turn it in. Okay, so those two sections are sitting next to each other, but they don't look very good, right? There's a few things that are going on, and this is what you're always going to do. You're always going to take a look at your design and add whatever you need to it. So look at it, what bothers you, and then how can you fix it? Web design, just like any other design discipline, is troubleshooting. It's figuring out problems. So right now I'm looking at this, and first off I see that my text content doesn't have breathing room. It's shoved right up to the edge of the element. Not good. There's a lot of extra space over here. The two sections are shoved to the left. Remember, following normal document flow, that's what happens. So there's some different things that I'm going to need to change. One thing I can already see is I actually don't like this fly kittens fly. I'm going to take care of that right now. So if I go back to my HTML and go down here, I see I have this H2. I don't even need that in there. I'm going to delete that out. Save that HTML and bounce back over to my CSS. Bring back my preview again as well. Okay, so I need to think about that and approach one problem at a time. I'm going to go with padding first because, I'm probably going to want to add both margin and padding, but padding is going to add to the overall size of my elements. So I probably want to add that first because that will grow the size of my elements, the size of my sections, and then I'll add margin after that. All right, so padding. I'm going to go back here to my section because I want the same padding in both sections. Usually with this type of spacing or layout, you want to have consistency. So if I have 2% padding on one section, I don't want 3% padding on another section. So that means I can just target my section element, my section selector, the element selector, so that it applies to both sections. So I'm just going to go back in here to my CSS, bring up that preview so you can see again. It's going to disappear. All right, so we'll add in our padding. I'm just going to do it to all four sides for now, and I'm going to add in 2%. Just for demo purposes, I'm going to go ahead and not split my screen anymore so that I can show you both the preview and the code at the same time, since we're only adding CSS at the moment. And I'll make it a little bit bigger. So padding 2%, and I can see over in my preview, I still have a little bit of room, which I want because I'm going to add margin as well, and or borders. Do you want to add borders? I'm not actually going to add borders, but you could. So next, after padding, and I can look over my preview and I can see that my text has breathing room here. It has padding. It's no longer shoved up against the edge of the element. Then I'll go back to my CSS. I'm also going to add margin. And the way that we're doing it right now, you're going to have to do trial and error. I'm going to go ahead and add in 1%. And I look at my preview and I see that's too much. So I may want to go back and forth between my padding and my margin until my sections still sit next to each other. So margin, I do want to go ahead and have that at 1%, which means I'm going to go back to my padding and maybe do 1.5. Still too much, so margin, I'm going to go back and maybe do 0.75. And they now sit next to each other, and I have just a tiny bit of room left over. So I'm going to go and do 0.8, maybe 0.85, 0.86, 0.87, 0.88, 0.89. And it looks like point 9 is going to be about what is going to work with this one. So it gives me my padding, it gives me my margin, but I don't have any extra space left over. And I'm not dropping down the line. So that looks pretty good. I may need to reapproach it later. That's the thing, is that as you start to add more and more code, you might then break code that you already had before, and you got to, stop and think about, all right, that just broke. What contributes to it? So if the size breaks, remember what contributes to the size. And, if something falls down or falls out, that's a size issue and a layout issue. So then think about what contributes to the size. It's going to be the width, the height, the margin, and the borders. Okay, so next let's go ahead and this is looking pretty gross, but that's okay. I'm going to leave the yellow for now, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to article. So remember, I have 3 articles around these articles here. I'm going to go ahead and make an element selector for article. I'm going to, I could go in and adjust the width and height. I don't need to. I'm allowing it to just inherit from its parent, and that looks fine to me. If it didn't, I have the article I then could add those other things to, but I don't need to. But for now, I do actually want to give them a different background color. I'm going to go ahead and set those to white, which is part of my color theme, but I don't need to bounce back over, because if anything, you're going to eventually remember the hex value for white and the hex value for black. Hex value for white is #FFFFFF. But remember from the lesson on working with color and the hex section, if your pairs, so remember the hex value is 3 pairs that make up the color. If they repeat the same character, then you don't need them all. You can combine, those pairs. So I just have FFF. For black, it is #000,000, which you can just then shorthand to #000. Okay, so now I can see that white behind it. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the yellow. So section, background, and you don't always have background colors to everything. Sometimes you don't have background colors to anything. You'll see a lot of websites either have a full white background, nothing is coded out with different background colors, and sometimes you just want to pick and choose. So I'm going to go ahead and give mine some white background. And now I can see that the text is shoved right up against the edge of the article element. That means the article needs some padding. So I'm going to give padding maybe 1%. I'm going to watch out and see if that breaks anything. It did not. But I gave that a little bit of breathing room inside those elements. I can see also that the elements, because they're block level, the articles are stacking right on top of each other. So I'm also going to add margin, but I don't want margin on all sides. I just want to kind of push them down. So I'm going to add margin dash bottom to all of these articles. And because I'm dealing with height, with margin bottom or top, then I'm going to go ahead and do pixels instead of percentage. So I'm going to give margin bottom of 20 pixels. And if I move my cursor, I can now start to see how I'm separating those out.